We're all swimming in these super complex economic models, right? But every now and then, a really simple metaphor just cuts right through all that noise. And today, we're going to dive into a pretty powerful one from an online commentator who goes by the Appalachian Gorilla. His whole argument? To really get what's wrong with the economy, you've got to stop thinking like an economist and start thinking like a mechanic who's staring down a sputtering engine. All right, let's get into it. So, right out of the gate, the author sets this really specific tone. I mean, listen to that quote. This isn't some Wall Street analyst, right? He's a self-described shade tree mechanic, a guy with the real-world hands-on know-how to make anything run. And that confidence you hear, that's absolutely key to his whole argument. The idea that a super complex system can actually be figured out with just simple, practical logic.
All right, so here's the core idea, the central metaphor he builds everything on. It's really simple. The economy is an engine. He's saying that just like a car engine, our economy is this massive system with thousands of parts that all have to work together. And his bet is, if you can wrap your head around how an engine works, well, you can pretty much understand the economy.
Okay, so let's break down exactly how he maps this thing out, piece by piece. First, the engine's geography. The block itself, that's the country's geography. Makes sense. Then you've got your fuel and air, the stuff that actually makes it go. He says that's us, labor and consumers. The spark that ignites the whole process? Well, that's capital and corporations. And finally, the oil, the stuff that keeps everything lubricated and running smoothly, that's the currency. So according to our mechanic, this economic engine is, well, it's definitely not running smoothly. You can hear it sputtering. So following his logic, it's time to pop the hood and run some diagnostics. We're going to walk through his troubleshooting process step by step to see exactly where he thinks the problem is. Okay, so what are the actual symptoms he's seeing? Well, the engine is missing on strokes, and there's smoke pouring out of the tailpipe. Now, in economic terms, you could think of that as, declining labor participation, or maybe just a lot of waste in the system. To the author, this isn't just a small hiccup. It's a huge flashing red light that something is fundamentally broken. Now, this is where his mechanic's logic, that process of elimination, really comes into play. So first on the checklist, does the engine even turn over? Yes, it moves. Okay, good. Next, he checks the spark. Remember, that's his stand-in for capital and corporations. And from his perspective, the spark looks great. He points to things like corporate stocks and CEO pay being just fine. So this leads him to a pretty simple conclusion. If the engine itself is okay and the spark is good, then the problem has to be the fuel. And that's the big question, isn't it? This is what the rest of his whole diagnosis hinges on. He's zeroed in on the fuel. And again, just to remind you and his metaphor, that's the labor pool and the consumers. So what on earth could be wrong with the fuel? Okay, so this brings us to his very specific and, let's be clear, pretty controversial diagnosis. He's decided the fuel has been contaminated, and he thinks he knows exactly what the contaminant is. And there it is. Someone put diesel in the gas tank. That is his stark bottom line conclusion. And you have to understand, for a mechanic, this is a catastrophic mistake. Putting diesel in a gasoline engine, it's going to make it run terribly. It'll sputter, it'll smoke, and if you let it go long enough, it'll seize up the whole motor. It is fundamentally the wrong type of fuel for that engine's design. So to be absolutely clear about what the author is saying here, let's just define his terms. In his analogy, gasoline is what he calls the Native American labor force, what he considers the engine's natural fuel. And the diesel, the contaminant he's talking about, he specifically claims that is immigrant labor, particularly from India. But he doesn't actually stop there. He says he's found a second problem that's just making the first one a whole lot worse. So, on top of this so-called contaminated fuel, he's also found vacuum leaks. In his metaphor, these leaks are his way of talking about issues with border integrity. A vacuum leak lets unmetered air into the system, which completely throws off that critical fuel-to-air mixture and makes the engine run even worse. Okay, so that's the diagnosis: the wrong fuel in the tank and vacuum leaks messing up the mixture. A good mechanic doesn't just tell you what's wrong, right? They tell you how they're going to fix it. So here is the author's prescription for what he calls a complete engine overhaul. His proposed solution is basically a three-step process. First, he says you have to siphon the tank. His translation of that is to remove what he calls the excess diesel. Second, install new gaskets. In his view, this means locking up the border to fix those vacuum leaks. And finally, he suggests we retard the timing. And what he means by that is that we need to slow down our expectations for economic growth, just to let the engine run a bit more smoothly without so much stress. Now, the author is actually pretty upfront that his fix involves a trade-off. He straight up says that after all this, we may lose a quarter or third of a tank. What he means is the economy might not go as far, it might not be as big or powerful, but in his view, the engine would finally be running correctly on its so-called natural fuel, and it wouldn't be shaking itself to pieces. So for him, it's a clear choice: stability over raw, unsustainable horsepower. And that really brings us to the final critical question that hangs over this entire idea. I mean, the author presents a super clear, very linear, and incredibly confident solution. But is a nation's economy, with all of its millions of human variables and unpredictable parts, is it really like a mechanical engine? Can you actually fix its problems by siphoning tanks and changing gaskets? That's the core question this whole metaphor really forces us to think about.